Hello, my name is Josh Mida, and I'm presenting my research presentation on assessing Christian traditional and portfolio assessments. And just by way of introduction, how we assess matters. Because, number one, our students matter. Jesus says this in Matthew 19, verse 14, "But Jesus said, Suffer little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." If the Lord Jesus values children, then we should so value children as educators. The education of children is a sacred honor that's been given to us not only by parents, but also by the Lord Himself. And each student is a gift from God, valuable in His sight and worthy of the best of educations. But secondly, because we are called to educate students. 1 Peter 4:10, the Apostle Peter writes, "As every man hath received a gift, even so minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." The task of teaching is great, especially in the day and age in which we live in. Young people need teachers who are committed to educational excellence. And God has called us into the realm of education, and it's incumbent upon us to steward that calling well. Furthermore, our students want to be challenged. Deep down, students want to learn. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we fulfill the task of teaching. Mark Rasmussen said this, "It is incumbent upon the instructor to challenge the students to improve." So how we assess matters because our students matter. Because we're called to educate our students. But also, number three, we are accountable for how we educate. James chapter 3 verse 10 says, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation." So just by way of a couple summary statements as we wrap up our introduction. Because education matters, it matters how we educate. And to bring into our topic today, assessment is one of the key measures by which we evaluate each student's educational progression. So, defining Christian traditional assessment. It's been said the purpose of traditional assessment procedures is to carefully evaluate if students have learned the content and to determine whether or not the students are successful in acquiring knowledge. Christian traditional assessment will utilize a variety of mediums. They will utilize tests, quizzes, oral evaluations like book reports, homework projects, and standardized testing. Secondly, let's look at defining portfolio assessments. A portfolio is a purposeful collection of student work that exhibits the student's efforts, progress, and achievements in one or more areas of the curriculum that includes content selection, selected by students, selection criteria, merit judging criteria, and evidence of self-reflection. In my research, I found that there are really three different types of portfolios within the classroom. There are documentation or working portfolios, process portfolios, and finally, assessment portfolios. So now that we've defined our terms, let's differentiate traditional and portfolio assessments. First of all, traditional assessments. Traditional assessments are, number one, teacher-centric. There are a variety. Teachers teach the material, and students are assessed over the material presented. Secondly, there are a variety in types of test questions. The most widely used traditional assessment tools are multiple choice tests, true-false tests, and short answers and essays. The types of questions asked help introduce different forms of thinking, ranging from recall even up to critical thinking. And these tests are primarily objective-based. In other words, there is a right answer and there is a wrong answer. Number three, the ability to recall and comprehend is emphasized. And they are usually timed. And they provide a decisive and independent form of assessment, usually after the academic content is shared. Now, let's look at portfolio assessments. Portfolio assessments are student-centered. In other words, these type of assessments focus on student empowerment and self-learning. Students are actually given more autonomy over the materials used to assemble their portfolios. Number 2, portfolio assessments emphasize learning over a period of time. Students are encouraged to demonstrate what they have learned by carrying out in-depth projects that take thought, time, dedication, and responsibility. They track developmental changes over a period of time and encourage the learner to engage in self-directed learning to his or her own empowerment. Whereas tests and quizzes that cover concentrated parts of the academics or the content is more defined by periods of time, portfolios do not. They cover wider ranges of the school year. And then number 3, portfolio assessment is subjective in nature. While there may not be a right or a wrong answer, students are given grades based upon the pre-existing criteria such as rubrics. So now that we've taken some time to differentiate between the traditional and the portfolio assessments, let's look at the strengths of each of these, the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these assessments. First of all, the strengths of traditional assessments. First of all, they're practical. They're practical. They save time in both preparing and grading. With teachers' busy schedules, they serve as a practical method of assessment. Most educators believe that this type of assessment is practical because it can be easily constructed and answers can be easily corrected based upon a defined answer key. Number 2, they are objective. They are objective. Traditional assessments are more structured and therefore more closely related to standardized tests, as there are correct answers and specific paths to follow in getting the answers. Traditional assessments give a clear snapshot of whether the students have remembered the content that he or she has studied. And then number 3, traditional assessments are equitable in format. Each student is given the same assessment. The notion of fair or unfair or some sort of bias is eliminated because each student is assessed over the same material through the same questions. And then one more strength that we see is that the criteria for feedback is also clear. Both teachers and students are aware of what needs to be studied and areas of needed improvement post-assessment. Let's look at a couple weaknesses. First of all, traditional assessment tends to focus on the lower level of learning through simple memorization and recall. And incidentally, certain traditional levels of assessment questions, i.e. multiple choice and true false, do not develop or encourage higher forms of critical thinking. So we see the strengths and the weaknesses of traditional assessments. Let's look next at the strengths and weaknesses of portfolio assessments. First of all, strengths. They encourage student accountability. Portfolio tasks that ask students to self-assess can show them the value of making a space to intentionally critique their own work. Students are encouraged to submit a variety of worksheets or other work-based projects to teachers who collect them throughout the year in order to see how students, how they are progressing from the beginning to the ending of the year. And they require the students to take a certain measure of ownership in their work. Well, secondly, they emphasize a higher order of thinking skills. Skills at the upper end, such as application, synthesis, and evaluation of experiences, appear to be best captured by providing evidential support in the form of a portfolio. Students are encouraged to use higher order critical thinking skills through their worksheet or project-based learning in order to show their understanding of content taught in class. But then one other strength, they endeavor to connect learning to real-life situations. Portfolio assessment procedures measure students' ability to apply knowledge of the content in real-life situations and ensure students' ability to use and apply what they have learned in meaningful ways. Students will comprise their portfolio of personal reflections of content taught, individual projects, classwork, or even teachers' personal notes. Portfolios are application-driven in that students are meant to bridge content taught with personal experience. However, in all the research that I did, it was difficult to ascertain what real-life situations, what that really meant. However, I do agree that students need to be able to connect content with real-life situations in order to reinforce the practicality of the education they are receiving. So those are the strengths. Let's look at the weaknesses of portfolio assessments. Number one, they require more time and energy to formulate. Teachers are already strapped for time in their profession, so developing portfolio assessments seem counterintuitive to a healthy work-life balance. They are subjective by nature. Scoring portfolios involve the extensive use of subjective evaluation procedures such as rating scales and professional judgment. And portfolio assessment was particularly useful in evaluating programs that had flexible or individual goals or outcomes. It seems that clear criterion for grading portfolios is lacking in this form of assessment. Number three, they are student-centered. Students have more autonomy over their portfolio submissions. This can be problematic because without clear guidelines, who is to know what quality work really looks like? And then while accountability is important, without structure and standards, students may present work that is incomplete or unsatisfactory relating to stated learning outcomes. So we've seen the strengths of Christian traditional assessment. We've seen the strengths and weaknesses of portfolio assessment. Now let's look at both of these forms of assessment in relation to present education. First of all, traditional assessment. There seems to be a concerted effort to push away from traditional forms of assessments. They are considered negative. They're considered rigid, fixed, and limited. Yet, despite studies that reveal traditional assessment is still popular, they are being replaced in favor of assessments that promote higher levels of thinking and more student reflection. Now, concerning the negativity, critics of traditional assessment accuse the form of assessment of hindering the development of the mind, or that it hinders the child's creativity. A response to that would be creativity is only one aspect of the educational and childhood development of each student. Portfolio assessment. The shift from a teacher-centered classroom to a student-centered classroom advocates for more portfolio assessments. And there is a multifaceted functions or goals within portfolio assessment. Portfolio use is driven by a range of influences, from individual reflective practices to mandatory professional requirements. And so it seems to be, in the present use of education, portfolio assessment is the most preferred form of assessment. Now let's look at the future influence on education in both of these assessments. I firmly believe that traditional assessment does still have a place in future education, but they must be intentional in their integration of higher level learning questions, and they must be tailored to overall teacher objectives and learning outcomes. See, teachers, when they set the direction of the class, they can assess through course objectives and learning outcomes, and they can assess in a way that meets those expectations. But portfolio assessment. Portfolios are lauded as a more authentic form of assessment. Authentic assessment techniques are generally criterion reference, tasks performed in real-life situations rather than isolation. And then also portfolio assessments, though not a new form of assessment, require areas of reflection for further improvement. In other words, there needs to be an integration of teacher training, provide clear expectations and purpose, and offer continual feedback. So, as we conclude today, portfolio assessment provides a useful balance to traditional Christian forms of assessment. Traditional assessments should be used as one of the many indicators of achievement, as each method assesses different skills and must be used with an understanding of their individual designs. Educators must also incorporate both traditional and authentic assessment procedures to accurately extrapolate growth. So I believe portfolio assessment should be integrated into traditional forms of assessment. And then educators would be wise to challenge students at all levels of learning, ranging from comprehension to evaluation. In doing so, teachers will be able to pinpoint areas of strength and weakness for each student. Teachers will begin with the end in mind. In other words, assessments based upon overall teaching objectives. This will provide room for flexibility in assessment types. Teachers, our calling to educate is a tremendous calling. Therefore, it matters how we assess.